Hi, I'm Jonathan Weinberg, and this is Drawing with Fountain Pens. Today I'm going to talk about one of my favorite architects and designers. This is Michael Graves, who died in 2015. He was a crucial architect, usually thought about as being a postmodernist architect. Now, postmodernism is one of those terms that means different things depending on who you talk to and what exactly you're referring to. In architecture, it has a very distinct meaning or association, and it's very different, I think, than what it means to people in painting and sculpture and other fields. Modernism, when we think of architecture, to be brief, we think of architects like Mies van der Rohe and the Bauhaus, and we think of Mies van der Rohe's very famous dictum, less is more. In the 1960s, Robert Venturi wrote a brilliant manifesto called Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, which really questioned that notion that less is more, and basically sort of suggested that less is less. Like everything, a lot of the revolutionary ideas that were at the beginning of the modernist movement by the 1960s were becoming cliche and boring. So take, for example, Mies van der Rohe's probably most famous building in the United States, the Seagram building in New York City. If you imagine a time when that building was the only building that looked like that on the block, and how elegant it is and how beautiful its detailing is, it would really stand out. But of course, it was imitated and was so successful that it stopped looking different from every other building. Although people who have a very knowledge of architecture and refinement look at the building and can see all kinds of elements in it and the way it's so beautifully scaled that it does look different, and it is more beautiful than other buildings like it. But nevertheless, modernist architecture and the kind of skyscrapers that it was promoting had a tendency to make cities all look the same, and particularly the corporate business part of the city. So by the 1960s and 70s, architects were looking for other ideas and questioning notions of modernism. For example, modernism had this idea that buildings should be true to their structure, the way they're built, and their material, that they shouldn't apply ornament. In the 19th century, if you were an architect and you were asked to build or design a courthouse, you designed that in a kind of classical style. But if you were asked to design a cathedral or church, you might do that in a Gothic style. And each style signified a different sort of function in terms of the building, rather than having an overall style for all different kinds of buildings, which is what was the modernist ideal. Now, again, I'm being very simplistic here, but I'm sort of just giving you a notion about certain ideas of modernism. Now, architectural historians love to point out that although the Seagram building seems to follow the structure of the building is made out of a steel cage construction, right? And the glass is hung from that steel, so the building follows the way it's constructed, right? But there's a part of the building on the side where all the machinery and different aspects of the building are sort of hidden, and yet the design continues over that section. So if you're really true to the building material and the skeleton of the building, you would not have done that. But Mies wanted the thing to look unified and beautiful, right? So modernism all the time was making certain compromises that actually would go against what might be the structure of the building. And then also this other notion that gets talked about a lot in pen design, actually, which is form following function. And if you have watched some of my videos, I'm always sort of questioning that notion, exactly what does that mean, and how, given the fact that, let's take a pen, for example, there are so many different ways in which you can make the form and the function one, that's not so an obvious thing. Anyway, in the 1960s and 70s, architects began to question these modernist notions, and above all, they began to think that it was not such a terrible thing to bring back ornament or to bring back historical styles, and to think less about trying to make something original or hyper contemporary, instead have it have significance that had to do with the culture or to past styles. And Michael Graves, who began his career and did beautiful houses in the 60s and 70s in a modernist style, was one of the first architects to embrace what we kind of call postmodernism, or sometimes it's referred to, or one part of postmodernism is thought of as being the new urbanism. But in any case, he began to do buildings that incorporated past styles, elements from classical architecture, elements from Art Deco. And in fact, I think that Michael Graves' use of certain classical elements, but kind of blowing them up and giving them a streamlined look, made his buildings and his designs have a quality that looks quite Art Deco-ish or Art Moderne. It's important to emphasize that Michael Graves' architecture still is distinctly modern and looks very 20th century, unlike some other postmodernists. I'm thinking particularly of Robert Stern, who literally imitate historical styles in much the same way that a 19th century Beaux-Arts architect might do a building in a Georgian style or Gothic style, depending on the project. Michael Graves' buildings always look distinctly like Michael Graves. He uses these big sort of blocky shapes and simplifies certain elements that you might get from history, like the dolphins in the Disney hotel come from Renaissance sources, but they're highly simplified. Or he takes Mickey Mouse and he turns Mickey Mouse into silhouettes when he designs a clock. It all looks very distinctly like Michael Graves, even when it's using some element from the past. Formally, if you look at a lot of different modernist buildings, and I'm thinking again of Mies, the walls of the outer part of the building is like a skin, and the skin shows you something of the skeleton of the building and how the building comes to be. It is related to the structures that are inside the building, and this is considered almost morally a kind of honesty about the building's construction. So a Bauhaus architect is not going to create a facade that looks like stone when it's made out of plaster, or fakes, or use fake brick, right? Now, Michael Graves has no qualms about using materials that imitate other materials to create certain associations or textures or colors. However, his work tends to be very three-dimensional and, as I say, kind of chunky looking, or we could say cubist looking. His buildings don't seem to have skin so much as to have been made out of almost like children's building blocks. I'm thinking particularly of the library that does in Denver, which he actually tried to make it look something like some of the elements like a pencil case, and have a certain kind of whimsical quality. So it's very important to him that a building have all kinds of associations. that have to do with the culture and the community rather than trying to reveal elements of how the building is made. Now, going back to his fountain pen, it's very interesting because most fountain pens, in terms of their outer form, have a kind of feeling of skin, right? If we think of a Mont Blanc 149, let's say, the shell of the pen is like the skin of the pen. But if you look at Michael Graves' design for Acme, you don't feel that at all. In fact, the grid is sort of puncturing the outside, and it gives it a kind of three-dimensionality to the pen, which is kind of surprising, even if it doesn't feel so great in the hand. Now on this channel, we've looked at several of the Acme Studio designs, some like the Keith Haring pen, in which basically they take a pen and they print on the outside, a design, a drawing, an image from a well-known artist. And it's not so much a matter of the shape of the pen, but the image that they have printed on the pen that gives it its connection to the artist. However, Acme has also commissioned over the years some architects to do pens that are often quite unusual looking, and in which a pen designer is really trying to do something that isn't just a matter of putting an image around the pen, but actually redesigning the whole pen. And that's the case of Michael Graves. Now, Michael Graves may be better known to a lot of you because he got so involved in the 80s with designing household goods, initially high-end for companies like Alessi, but then working with Target and other companies to make products that often were quite inexpensive, also doing beautiful line of objects for Disney. Michael Graves is particularly associated with Disney. Disney in the 1980s became very involved with working with different architects in Florida around a Disney world. And Michael Graves' design, I think some of his most beautiful buildings are the two buildings he designed for hotels in Disney World. The Dolphin I actually stayed in, and I think is just fabulous, the way in which it uses certain classical motifs and combines them in a shape and a kind of building that is obviously very 20th century, contemporary, but has all these elements. He, for example, also embraced in his buildings color, which a lot of architects tended to avoid. I mean, unless you think of white or black as being colors, right? Everything is very stripped down in modernism. White is particularly something that modernist architects like to use: white walls and white grids and et cetera, et cetera. Michael Graves' buildings have this kind of chunky quality to them. And those design elements are then incorporated into a lot of his designs for kitchens. The Alessi teapot is probably his most famous household design, which originally he did it in a very expensive version and then a less expensive version. And but for Target he did all kinds of things like clocks and all kinds of kitchen supplies for very inexpensive prices. His idea was that everybody deserves good design. This pen, getting back to the fountain pen, originally was $180, which is pretty expensive in 2001 when they were being sold at that time. So it wasn't cheap. And I think you can see that this is an example of putting an entire new design on the pen, and not just putting a drawing, because this is very three-dimensional. And it reminds me, in fact, of the kind of grid that you see windows in a building. It has a kind of architectural quality to it. So it doesn't surprise me that an architect does this pen. And then it's interesting because it's not, this is not a pen design that's going back to the 19th century. It does look very 20th century because it's a grid, and grids are very popular in all kinds of modernist work. But the coloring, the gray silver, the way in which the sort of top sort of moves in with the line here, the rounding of the clip, that all gives it a slightly, to me, Art Deco-y feel to it, a kind of 30s feel to it, which after all is part of modernity. It has a surprisingly small nib, and it does post. In fact, it screws on, so it makes it quite a heavy pen. I think it's quite beautiful. It looks great. But, big surprise, this grid and the way that it's metal and it's sharp is actually quite unpleasant on your hand. Yeah, you're supposed to hold it here, but it's very heavy and you feel it still here. So this is an example, I think, of a design that looks great, but is not really very comfortable and really isn't great for everyday writing. Michael Graves designed some other pens that are more traditional in their material and shape. This is the best looking of their pens, of the pens they designed for Acme, but it is, I think, probably the least comfortable. I have not been able to try those other pens. One subtle aspect about the design is the way in which the cap and the body come together. It probably would be tricky or trickier to create a design where it screws together and comes together perfectly, so that the grid is the same. So instead of doing that for whatever reason, which would have looked like this, I guess, if you can see that, they chose, or Michael Graves chose, to kind of line the clip up with this. So actually it goes like that. If you can see, it doesn't line up this way. The only thing that kind of lines up is the clip in this part. But I say kind of because it doesn't line up quite perfectly. And I think that's somewhat of a problem. I also think it just would have made more sense if it had come together like this, but maybe the tolerance and the expense of doing that was too much. Keep in mind they had to come up with a completely different design for a pen and still make it relatively affordable. And I don't know what was involved in redoing all the machinery so that they could create something that looked like this. There's really no other pen in Acme Studios group of pens that's quite like this. So, that often involves compromise. And one of the things that's exciting about Michael Graves' designs and working with places like Target as well as Alessi, is coming up with designs that are not only beautiful but are quite affordable, particularly if you're going to design for J.C. Penney and Target, right? So you have to make compromises, and yet he believes strongly that everybody deserves good design. Whether good design is a matter of aesthetics or function is always a big issue. And I think this is an example of a pen that doesn't function so well, but looks great. I think there are plenty of Michael Graves designs, for example, for Disney, and the way he incorporates different elements of Mickey Mouse into his work that look great and function super well. But unfortunately, this is not one of them. Now, this pen also comes in a rollerball, which I was able to get very cheaply because I think whoever was selling it had no idea that who Michael Graves was. I got this for under $80. I think it was $75, while the other the fountain pen I was able to get for around $300. Both these pens are hand signed. So you can see this is Michael Graves' signature. I don't know why, but Acme around 2005 got him to sign this. But the person who sold me the rollerball didn't seem to, I don't think they realized that this was a hand signature. This is also Michael Graves' signature, and I don't know when he did this. Now, one of the things about the rollerball, the fountain pen, is that you can put them on, they are interchangeable. So how does it write? Okay, this is the Acme Michael Graves grids fountain pen. This is, I think, a fine. This is Pelican 4000 Royal Blue cartridge. Surprisingly, the pen did not come with a converter, and so I put a Pelican so-called international style cartridge into it, and I assume that a converter for really European pens will fit. I actually tried some Chinese converters I had around, they didn't fit. So don't assume that every converter is going to fit. It is not a great nib, particularly if you keep in mind that when it first sold, it was not an inexpensive pen. It's a steel nib, it's like a nail, and it's a bit scratchy. But it writes. It's a little dry. Michael Graves is a wonderful designer. One thing I didn't talk about is how towards the end of Michael Graves' life he had I guess a stroke, and he became unable to walk and had to live the last 15 years or so of his life in a wheelchair. As a result, he became very interested in designing wheelchairs and all kinds of things for people who were disabled. And he became very aware of how expensive those things are. And that's one of the other wonderful things about Graves, that he really had a strong sense that people should be able to afford good design. And surely if you're disabled or ill, you should be able to afford the best designed equipment. Now, a lot of people would never have, even tried the pen because it's such an obvious collector's item by a famous architect. But I am always a big believer in using pens. And it looks to me like a Schmidt-lit nib. It doesn't say on the nib that it's Acme. It's probably made in Germany. And as I say, the pen looks great. I mean, it looks great in the hand and everything. It's just very unpleasant the way these sharp design, this kind of outer grill work, it's really like a grill work, feels on the hand. Makes a lot of sense visually, but it doesn't make sense physically as far as I can, as far as I'm concerned. And I suppose that's the way that often people feel about designers. I think actually it's strange for Michael Graves. I think that a lot of Michael Graves' designs have a kind of whimsy to them and an elegance to them, but they also function very well. I don't think that's the case here. And I wonder, actually, as he developed other pens for Acme, whether he too began to sort of feel that way. I'm not sure of the chronology, because he didn't design anything else that was like this. And I think, if he was really somebody who used it. One of the things I love about Michael Graves is that he was a great believer in drawing and promoter of drawing. He lived during a time in which architects increasingly were doing their designs first with models. That was very popular in the 60s and 70s, to create all kinds of models and even to design things in models. And then the other thing was to use computers later to do all the work that you're doing in. And he was a great believer in that you really should try to use pencil and paper and pen in the process, because he felt that that was a very great way, intuitive way to sort of feel out what the design should be. And obviously that's something that I am a great believer in. So this pen writes fine. It's okay, but it's nothing to write home about. And so I would give this pen A+ for looks, but kind of C for writing, and D for comfort. And yet, I really like the way it looks, and that to me is something in terms of, how a pen, because, there are a lot of pens that are very comfortable, but there are very few that are really works of art, and I think this is a work of art. I can't own a Michael Graves house, but at least I can own a Michael Graves pen.